And when you look at that, that is not unusual, I think, for anybody to be consuming over their actual requirements. And when you look at that, I think the question that you start to ask yourself is not why are so many people fat, but why doesn't everybody get fat? How do we know how much to eat? How do we know we're not over-consuming just by that small amount and getting fat over the years? Well, in fact, most animals and us have an inbuilt mechanism for detecting how much food we need and regulating our appetite to try and match that. And you can see it beautifully in many rodent species. It is very hard to get a normal rat to actually overeat. If you increase the energy content of his diet, he reduces his food intake. There's all sorts of different chemical signals being produced by many tissues in the body, including the brain and his adipose tissue and everything, which will actually tell him, I've had enough now, stop eating, that will do. And we know that because there are several mutants, two of which are shown here. This one you can probably see better is here. These mutants either cannot produce some of these chemical signals, and the one we're talking about here is a chemical called leptin, which you may have heard of, or their receptors which recognize the leptin don't work properly. And when we get these mutations, they can no longer control their food intake. And as a result of that, a guy who should look like that ends up looking like that. And when we discovered that, there was a lot of excitement. Have we found the reason why some people get fat and some people don't? Unfortunately, the answer is no. There's a very, very small number of people who have a genetic abnormality in, say, the leptin receptor or in the production of leptin who are very prone to obesity. But for the vast majority of people who are overweight and obese, I'm afraid the answer is much more simple. We have found a way to pack as much energy as possible into our food and make it as palatable as possible. If you think of a Mars bar or any other chocolate bar, it's very rich in fat, it's very rich in sugar, in sucrose, it's highly palatable. We like the taste, and every gram of it is packed full of calories. And basically, by doing that to our food, we've managed to overcome many of these natural senses that we have in our body to tell us we've eaten enough and we overeat. Put that together with the fact that we're doing less and less exercise, and unfortunately, the answer is incredibly simple. We eat too much and we don't do enough activity, and that's why as a population we're getting fat. Does it matter? Well, we do know one thing. We've known one thing for a long time, and it's illustrated very nicely from this data from the United States. You get similar data from anywhere in the world. This is what's happened in terms of obesity in the United States. If you go back to 1994, relatively small numbers of people were obese. Most of the United States people were, the average in the individual states was less than 14% of the population of the state being obese, or between 14 and 18%. So you went to 2000 and 2008, more and more people got fatter and fatter in more and more states, and you can see now virtually the whole of the east of the United States is dark red now, which means that more than 26% of the people living in those areas are obese. You can map that very closely to the development of what we call type 2 diabetes, or non-insulin dependent diabetes. It is directly related to being fat. As you get obese, your risk of developing diabetes increases dramatically, and you can see the graphs on the bottom are changing colour, probably just behind the graphs on the top. So as people get more and more fat, following just behind, we're getting more and more instances of type 2 diabetes. We know that people who've got type 2 diabetes are at an increased risk of developing heart disease. We've known that for many, many years. That's where I started my work when I did my PhD. So we've got something going on here which is in danger of reversing that trend in our decrease in heart disease over the years. And that's a worry. But that's not the only problem. One of the things we know is even those people who are obese, who don't develop full-blown diabetes, very often are metabolically compromised. And what I mean by that is if you took a non-diabetic obese person and you gave them a glucose tolerance test, which is essentially just giving them a drink of glucose very often they will manage to maintain their blood glucose within the normal levels. Let me just explain this diagram slightly. This is the normal range for non-obese people. So most of us will manage to maintain our blood glucose within this range throughout the 180 minutes following a glucose load. An obese person who isn't diabetic will usually just about also manage to stay within that same range. Maybe bumping along at the top, but they're not diabetic, they keep their glucose normal. To do that, however, they have to produce vastly more amounts of the hormone insulin than a non-obese person does. So in response to that glucose load, that's the level of blood insulin that you might see in these people. That's the level that an obese person will have to produce to keep their glucose under control. We call this insulin resistance. Now eventually, in some of those obese people, their pancreases, which produce the insulin, will start to fail and they won't be able to maintain that very high output. That's when they'll become diabetic. For others, they'll stay in this insulin-resistant state. And that insulin-resistant state is associated with a whole cluster of risk factors for heart disease. Slightly raised blood glucose, hypertension and increased blood pressure, a raised level of fat, triglyceride in their blood. The good cholesterol tends to go down, so they've got low HDL cholesterol. The adipose tissue, the fat tissue, is producing a whole lot of molecules called inflammatory molecules, which make your body feel it's in a state of attack, and these inflammatory molecules could attack your artery walls and start the process of atherosclerosis, which causes heart disease. Your blood becomes more likely to clot. Having a blood clot is one of the things which leads to a heart attack. And the amount of free fatty acids that are floating around in your blood are elevated. In recent years, that cluster of risk factors has been referred to as the metabolic syndrome. And it's believed that even in obese people who aren't suffering from full-blown diabetes, many of them will have this metabolic syndrome. They're at an increased risk of heart disease, and we're in a real danger of seeing that constant drop in the number of deaths from heart disease starting to go back up again. It's all really depressing, isn't it? It gets worse, because there's another silent thing going on in these people, and this relates to their livers. Many of you know the dangers of overconsumption of alcohol and the effect it has on your liver. It leads to what we call fatty liver. That can progress to cirrhosis. That can progress to liver failure or to liver cancer, and many alcoholics will die from liver disease. What's sneaked up on us in the last 5 years, probably, to be quite honest, is the fact that this is starting to happen in people who don't drink. This is happening in people who are overweight and are insulin resistant. And as many as 20 to 30% of the population of the UK, of the US, and in most industrialized countries have been estimated to be suffering from something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a buildup of fat within your liver. At first, you have no idea it's happened. It doesn't have any symptoms whatsoever. It then develops into what's called steatohepatitis. That's when you might start to feel it. Your liver becomes inflamed, you may have pain, and it can lead, just like alcoholic fatty liver disease, to cirrhosis. And some real concern at the moment that we have a time bomb ticking of people who are obese, who are insulin resistant, who are developing steatosis and don't even know it, who are going to end up in hospital with liver disease because of that. So, certainly within our division, I would suggest in any department of nutrition within the country, within the world even,